NBC Sports Radio.
What's that? The NBA is off until Thursday? Wow. This is the most wonderful time of the year, isn't it? By the way, that comment is, what did we learn coming out of Dan Patrick? You know, baseball, all you need a pitcher, a catcher, and a hitter. It is becoming frightfully true. You got to give some credit there. Hello, I'm Marky Bilson, your voice of choice for a new generation of Tri-Cities sports fans. The name of the program is Tri-Cities Sports Now. We own the Tri-Cities on 1420 NBC Sports Radio Tri-Cities. We've got the best guests. We've got the hardest hitting opinions. We really do. And in fact, I'm going to throw one out to begin the program, which is, who is more likely to be able, what's more likely to happen on a year-to-year basis? ETSU to win the Southern Conference Men's Basketball Championship, or UT to win the Southeastern Conference Football Championship. And I don't think that there's any competition between these two. Anyway, in a few minutes I'm going to talk to Jerry Bonkowski, he of NBCSports.com, a little Daytona 500 talk. Wrapping that up, where do we go from here? Talk a little bit, got the latest Vols news coming up. A little bit of, although it was, throwing some shade at the NBA, a little bit look at, we might do a media watch, or at least have some media stories out there, some football news, pro football news and such, and just general, talk a lot about what have you. Hopefully your calls at 423-743-6124 when the time is right. What I want to get to, though, is the big news in the area last night. No, it wasn't high school basketball. It was the key basketball figure of the area, that being Steve Forbes, a weekly guest here on Tri-Cities Sports Now. He was given, I think, the greatest contract ever given to an ETSU coach. Now, admittedly, with inflation and all this, I'm not going to go into, let's adjust for inflation, what Madison Brooks' last contract was. I assume, though, that $650,000 a year is more than ETSU has ever paid another coach. I'm assuming that. But considering that that's almost double what ETSU is going to pay Randy Sanders. Now, Sanders will still make in the estimate of what Forbes is going to make because he's got his old Florida State contract that'll pick up some of the balance. But still, this is perhaps the biggest statement of ETSU saying, we want a college basketball power in Johnson City. There has probably never been an action like this in the history of the program. Look, the contract extends to 2023. That's 5 years. That means you're going to have space for Forbes to recruit. It's common knowledge. It isn't spoken much around here. I don't know why. But a coach needs 4 years on his contract from the season that he's in now to be able to recruit. I heard people say, well, Tennessee, they might keep Butch Jones around. He's got 4 years left on his contract. That means that Butch Jones is in the last year of his contract. In major college football, it's just a given. 4 years ahead of time, you need to recruit. And now ETSU, which has not always subscribed to that fact, being a mid-major and having a following that is less than critical, well, then you know what happens? They're able to get away with, let's say, how they handled Carl Torbush. Carl Torbush was never given a contract extension. He was called the greatest football coach of all time, practically, when he retired with an 11-22 record at ETSU, but he was never given a contract extension. Paul Hamilton operated on a year-to-year basis. He was never given 4 years. You want to know why the ETSU football program has historically sunk, but now ETSU, still with a vote in the top 25, by the way. They're still getting others receiving votes. This time the writer is from Honolulu, as a matter of fact. But anyway, we're going to just say this is necessary. You must give in college athletics, and somebody will find exceptions to this, I'm sure, but those exceptions will only prove the rule. You must have 4 years ahead of time to be a quality recruiter in college athletics. And the fact that ETSU is now given Forbes 5 years means that they are at least serious about winning in college basketball. Now, it does not mean that he's automatically going to be the ETSU coach for life. Look at Bo Oshanye. Signed a contract extension just last month to be ETSU soccer coach. Last week, he went to Dartmouth. $650,000 is a lot of money for a Southern Conference coach. It's not a lot of money for an ACC coach or a Big Ten coach. But what it will do is keep everybody but those Big Five conferences away from Forbes. You may be able to find exceptions. I know that Greg Marshall has a multi-million-dollar contract at Wichita State, but look at Wichita State. They used to be in the Missouri Valley Conference. Now they're in the American. That's the number 6 conference overall thought of, at least in football circles. Of course, we're talking basketball, but they basically went to a conference that was more likely to get multiple bids, although the Missouri Valley has received multiple bids to the NCAA tournament in the past. But what it boils down to is that Forbes last year, he interviewed for the job at New Mexico. Went to Pete Weir. Pete Weir signed a contract for $625,000 this year. Steve Forbes is now going to make more money than Pete Weir. So the New Mexicos of the world, a 14-time NCAA tournament program, ETSU's made it 10, by the way, a program that once hosted the Final Four, well, back 1983, that's not happening again, but still. That program, which probably does consider itself a little more major than mid, is not going to be able to get Steve Forbes. I theorized a week ago, LaSalle looks like they look like they're going to make a coaching change. They currently pay their coach about $750,000. Well, now you figure in things like Pennsylvania state income taxes versus Tennessee, which does not have them. You take a look at property values in East Tennessee, buying a house here than you would, let's say, a nice house in the Philadelphia area. And $650,000 in Johnson City is probably going to go about as far as $750,000 a year will in Philly when it goes down to it. Now you'll have the A10, that lure and all that. But right now, ETSU put themselves on a par with an Atlantic 10 program. What this means is that in the past, when Ed Duchillis interviewed at Duquesne, start of the century, really, it was 2001, LaSalle also in the Atlantic 10, those Atlantic 10 schools probably are not going to be able to afford Steve Forbes anymore, especially when you have to pay a $500,000 buyout clause. Now, again, SEC, Pac-12, those guys, yeah, they will be able to. But unless you're in the Major 5, maybe a Big East exception, something like that, you're not going to be able to hire or afford Steve Forbes anymore. That's what this means. Now, again, it doesn't make Forbes the coach for life at ETSU, because there are programs that, as I just mentioned, can pay more. And one of them might be Iowa. And I've told you to take a look and keep an eye on Iowa. They've sunk to the bottom of the Big Ten standings. They've got 3 games left, 2 regular season, 1 in the Big Ten tournament. Assuming they lose all 3, because they're likely going to be facing teams with better records than they are, certainly in the last 2 regular season games, and then in the Big Ten conference, or Big Ten tournament, and eventually you're going to lose if you're Iowa. Iowa isn't winning the national championship this year, so one way or the other, Iowa is, if they lose their last 2 regular season games, going to lose 20 games this year, and probably finish in last place in the Big Ten. So, what does this mean? It means Fran McCafferty who, by the way, I am reading online things like, "Your seat is on fire, sir." He might not be long for the Iowa Hawkeyes. And Steve Forbes is from Iowa. Now, however, McCafferty, I'm not convinced that Iowa is going to get rid of him. I don't have any inside knowledge. I just have the same speculation reading on the internet that you do. Maybe I could call our friend back up at the Hawkeye. Hey, is McCafferty going to make it? But, that's sort of an insight. But even that would be an opinion. What I would look at in McCafferty is that he's 2 years off of taking Iowa to 3 straight NCAA tournaments. And he just signed a contract extension to 2024, actually 1 year longer than what Forbes just signed at the beginning of the season back in November. 58 years old, but you then give Fran McCafferty 1 bad year if you're Iowa. Maybe you do. So maybe that job doesn't come open. It would be, and for that matter, it's a Big Ten team. They may look down their nose at ETSU no matter how successful, barring Final Four appearance or something, like that you wouldn't have considered before. University of Pittsburgh. They're having a lousy year. Haven't won an ACC game. Old Kevin Stallings, late of Vanderbilt. Nobody likes him in Pittsburgh. Just has done nothing but lose. Wasn't the coach that they really wanted when he was hired, etc., etc. Usually you give a coach 3 years. He's been there 2. Do they give him the 3rd? Do they say, okay, 1 more year, and all this, new athletic director, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Again, here's a guy whose seat is burning. But it's going to take a program like that, Pitt now in the ACC, to be able to lure Steve Forbes away. Louisville and Ole Miss. By the way, Ole Miss. Talked to Steve Forbes on this show yesterday. He said, no, I have not had any contact with Ole Miss. Or at least he hasn't received any comments from Oxford. I guess the AD could have called from some other place other than Oxford, but I would think that, he would say, and I know also, one could say, well, would he be honest with me? You'd hope so. Ed DeChillis, a lot of his reputation locally was lost when it's pretty much assumed that he was asked, has Penn State contacted you? And it came out in the John City Press on a Tuesday. No, they haven't. Came out later that week. He was interviewing for the Penn State job. That didn't look good on DeChillis. And Forbes is kind of, he's gotten into trouble with the show cause before. And that might be a reason why Ole Miss, or for that matter Louisville, who both may have coaching vacancies, assuming they don't keep their interim coaches around, they might be wary of a Steve Forbes. We've heard about the FBI investigation. Major programs may be losing their coaches. All right, so now free reign on the mid-majors, possibly. But do those programs then go after someone who, rightly or wrongly, had a 1-year show cause penalty? My guess is a lot of them will never consider Steve Forbes. Maybe not all, but certainly enough. And that increases the chance, as certainly the extension did, of Forbes staying in Johnson City. And by the way, let's just look at 2 schools that, if they do make coaching changes, Iowa and Pitt, might, okay, that show, how dirty was he really? All that. They might look at that. Obviously, it didn't bother ETSU. So, an Iowa, a Pitt, not on probation. If they were interested, maybe. But then again, and I've said this before, Forbes is now 53. This is getting long in the tooth for schools to hire coaches. There have been some circumstances in which coaches, have received the hire. Look at that age, what I'm trying to say, look at Rick Barnes. Okay, look at Rick Barnes. But Barnes was established. Barnes was going to the NCAAs every year at Texas when he went to Tennessee. Forbes, even if the Bucks make the NCAAs this year, that's 2 straight appearances. That's not 19 and 20 years like Barnes had when he came to Tennessee. Look at 8. That's a track record of success. Ben Howland had a track record of success. Forbes, only been a head coach for 3 years. There is a difference. And like I said, frankly, a major program might look down their nose at a mid-major hire. They may want an assistant or an already named coach from a major program, as Tennessee did with Rick Barnes. So it's for these reasons that I've always said that Forbes does have a chance to stick around in Johnson City for a while, for a 10-year career, if not more, and really build a program that might see the Bucs return to national rankings for the first time since 1991. This contract extension, $650K a year, supports, though not ensures, that reasoning. And if this reasoning is true, then perhaps, and this is where we're all coming from, this is the big deal. This is the point I want to make to the local Tri-City sports fan. Perhaps this contract can allow ETSU to shed some of its inferiority complex. And it still exists around the program today. You hear it when you hear fans say, hey, ETSU is winning, so Forbes is gone. Not necessarily. It's a chance, not necessarily, especially with this extension, and for the reasons that I just told you over the last 10 minutes. Or the inferiority complex, ETSU shouldn't have football. But even if Forbes does depart for a major program, Iowa, Pitt, Louisville, Ole Miss, wherever, hopefully there won't be the mindset that accompanied the Bucs of the 1990s, the glory years. There was a feeling, and even spoken of in local media, that the success was only temporary. It couldn't be built upon. To that I say hogwash. In modern times, it's more reasonable for ETSU men's basketball to compete for their conference title on an annual basis than it is for Tennessee football to compete for an SEC football championship on an annual basis. And if you don't believe me, since the last time the Vols took the SEC crown, ETSU has made the NCAA tournament a grand total of 5 times. And it might be a 6th this year. 6 conference titles for ETSU basketball since the last conference title for Vols football. You tell me what's more likely to happen. It's pretty likely I'm going to talk to Jerry Bonkowski in our next segment about the Daytona 500 right here on Tri-City Sports Now.
To the city streets, Firestone Destination Tires.